Alright, in this video we're going to focus on two things. The first thing, we're going to talk about what it takes to add more LEDs. So for every LED we blink, there's code that we have to add. Before we do, when we wire the LEDs, you can see that each LED is going to be wired individually with a resistor and a wire connecting it to a pin. So this is an example of 5, and you could repeat this process for a sixth. Okay? In addition to wiring each one separately like that and connecting each one to its own pin, what we also have to do is create whole new sets of lines of code. So this next LED, we'll call this one, what we'll have to do now is where we assign these variables, the pin number, we'll have to make multiple variables. So we'll call that LED1. Maybe our second one could be LED2, and so on, okay? And maybe that one would be connected to pin 3, and so on. One thing I want to point out, this diagram is bad because it has one of them connected to pin 1. When wiring, we want to avoid using pins 0 and 1 because the Arduino is actually using those pins when it communicates to the computer, and that communication can actually interfere with the operation there. So don't use pin 0 or 1, use pins 3 and up, or 2 and up. And so we'll put the second LED on pin 3. Then we have to set it as an output. So we'll say again pin mode LED comma output, and you can even copy these and paste them. You don't have to retype them. So that was 1. This would be 2. Okay, and then we'll write them high and low. Okay, now one option would be to turn 1 on, then the second, then the third, and so on, by using a sequence like this. So this sequence right here, if I change this to a 2, is going to turn the first one on and off, and the second one on and off, and then so on if you have more. But we can modify this. So let's say I move this command right here. If I move it and put it right here, okay, then what's going to happen is these two are going to turn on together, and then they're going to turn off together, and it's going to cycle through that on and off together at the same time. So now they're blinking together instead of in sequence. And if I wanted to, I could alternate them, so make this one be low and that would be high, and so now they're going to take turns being on and off. Okay, and then so this kind of gives you an example of how you could do them in sequence. Was that first option, the second one was on and off at the same time, and then this third one would be alternating on and off. Okay, so those are things that you could think about when you're building your sketch with the 6 LEDs. Okay, now you might not get to this for this next class period. The next thing I'm going to show you probably will just have time to work on the 6 LEDs. But if you get to it, I want to show you the next thing, and it's going to be relevant for, if not today, or if not tomorrow, then the next day. And this is about using a button. So all this time we've been using LEDs as an output. Okay, now I'm going to talk about using an input as well. So I'm going to reset this sketch. So here we are back at our basic Arduino sketch, and before we get started, I want to show you how you actually wire a button in place. Okay, so here we have a diagram that is a button wired into place. It's connected to a pin, just like the LED is connected to a pin. In this case, I've got the LED on pin 5 and the button on pin 3. Now if you look carefully, this LED is wired with a resistor, just like we've been using, and this is a 330 ohm, or like an orange brown. If you look at this one, this is a different kind of resistor. It's got brown, black, orange, which represents 10,000 ohms. Okay, now you need to look very carefully at the wiring. So this button's connected to the 5 volt. That's connected to one side of the button. The other side connects to the pin and also to the ground. Okay, and so we connect it like this. And if you want to talk about why we have to do it that way, we can in class. But it's a little bit tricky. But just this is when you use a button. This is what the wiring for it looks like for now. Okay, so we go here and we'll say, okay, the LED was on pin 5. I'm going to also do a button on pin 3. Okay, and just like I set the LED as an output, I now have to set the button as an input, because now I'm taking in information whether or not the button is pressed. Okay, And then I want to say, okay, we're going to say digital read button. Okay, and so what that's going to do is it's going to read the button. It's going to check if it's open or closed. So basically what it's doing is checking the pin 3 to see if there's being a voltage applied there or not. If the button's closed, the voltage being applied. If it's not closed, there's no voltage applied there. Okay, now for this to work though, we have to do something with that information. So the way this works is that this is going to read it, and it's going to get a 1 if pressed, or it's going to be 0 if not pressed. Okay, and we need to do something with that information. And so the thing that we do with that information is we're going to store it into another variable. Okay, for now we'll call it button status. Okay, and we'll set button status as 0 so it starts off not being pressed. Okay, and so what we're going to say is button status is equal to digital read button. So what's going to happen here now is that if this button is pressed, it's going to send a 1 and store it into here. Or if the button is not pressed, it's going to send a 0 and send it to there. Okay? And now we know that whether or not the button's pressed. We have a place where we store that information, but that's still not enough. Okay, so the next piece I want to show you is the way that we can use code to make a decision. Okay, whenever you want to make a decision and do one thing or another thing, you use something called an if statement. So we're going to put if, and then we put parentheses, and then we put these kind of open closed braces, kind of like we have for the loop. And then anything that's within these braces is what happens if the button is pressed. Okay, and so what we'll say is if button status, and the way we check if it's pressed, remember if it's pressed it gives a 1, so we want to check if it's equal to 1. But the way that we check if it is equal to is we use a 2 equal signs. Okay, the reason why this is if it's 1 equal sign, that means we're assigning a new value. So 2 equal signs means to compare it. So we're comparing button status to 1. If button status is the same as 1, it's going to do whatever's between these two braces. If button status is not equal to 1, then it's going to skip over this and repeat the loop again. So what we'll do is we can take this blink here where we make it blink, and we can put it in this if statement so that it only blinks if the button is pressed. Okay, and so we can take this and we can copy it and paste it into here. Okay, and I'm going to mess around with the formatting so it looks pretty, or at least looks the way it's supposed to. Okay, and so this is anytime you have something in braces, it gets tabbed over. So now what's going to happen is in this sketch, if the button is pressed, we check its status, or we assign its status to button status, and if it's pressed, it blinks, and if it's not pressed, it's not going to blink, it's just going to stay off. Okay, and that's what this function does. One thing that you want to do if you have a button is add a little bit of delay, maybe like 100 milliseconds in between reading it. Okay, the next thing we could do, maybe we want to say, well, if the button's pressed, I want the light to turn on, and if the button's not pressed, I want it to turn off. In which case, when you have an if and an or an if and an else, then we can add here an else. And what we're doing is we're giving it an option for what to do when the button's not pressed. Okay, and so what's going to happen here is this. Now, if the button is pressed, it's going to turn the light on. Otherwise, it's going to turn the light off. So button status is going to end up being equal to 0 or 1. So if it's 1, it's going to do this. If it's not 1, it's going to do this. And now we have a program here that's going to check if a button's turned on. And so if you're pressing that button, the light will turn on. When you let go, the light should turn off. Okay, and so this is one way that we can use a button as an input. Now this is the most basic kind of input we can use. There's other much more advanced ones. Okay, but to summarize, to use a button or an input, we're going to assign a value for the button's pin. We're also going to find a placeholder to hold on to what the information regarding the button. We'll set the button as an input. We're going to read the button to determine it's pressed, and we're going to make a decision based on whether it's pressed or not. Okay? And so what happens is, this happens in a sequence. If the button is pressed, it's going to turn on. If it's not pressed, it's going to turn off. And here it actually waits a second, and then waits another 1/10 of a second. And so what you might find if you're testing this out, sometimes you could change pulling your finger off or on the button, and it might not change right away. So one thing we could do is we could eliminate these delays, and it should change quicker. However, since it's cycling through this loop, if when you press the button, it's during this part right here, it's not going to register a change. And if you press the button, or if you hold the button down, you'll see it cycling through. Okay? So anyway, hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully it wasn't too much too fast, and hopefully it wasn't too confusing. Please let me know what questions you have. And this is kind of the next thing we're going to be doing, using an input. And past this, we can get a little bit cooler inputs beyond this. Okay?